The summer of 1943 marked a terrifying juncture in the strategic bombing campaign over occupied Europe. The United States Army Air Forces had committed entirely to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, a philosophy built upon the theoretical invulnerability of the heavy bomber formation. The architects of this doctrine believed that a tightly packed combat box of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses could create an impenetrable defensive matrix of overlapping machine gun fire capable of fighting its way through any fighter opposition to strike the industrial heart of Nazi Germany and return home. This theory, however, was collapsing under the brutal reality of the skies over the continent. The Luftwaffe had rapidly adapted to the American formations, deploying heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 interceptors that systematically slaughtered the unescorted bomber streams. The casualty rates for the 8th Air Force stationed in England had reached catastrophic levels, often hovering around 10% per mission. For the men flying inside the freezing aluminum hulls of the bombers, surviving the mandatory 25 mission tour was statistically impossible. The mathematical certainty of death hung over every airfield in East Anglia. It was an environment of industrial slaughter where the rigid doctrines written by men sitting at desks in Washington were paid for in blood at 25,000 feet. At the center of this doctrinal failure was a fundamental misunderstanding of aerial gunnery. The official training manuals issued to every gunner in the Army Air Forces established strict rules of engagement. The manuals dictated that gunners must hold their fire until the approaching enemy fighters crossed the 300-yard threshold. The logic behind this regulation was based on ammunition conservation and the effective range of the optical gun sights. Instructors argued that firing beyond 300 yards was an absolute waste of the limited ammunition carried aboard the bomber and that the tracers would simply disperse harmlessly into the sky. But this academic logic completely ignored the terrifying physics of modern aerial combat. A German fighter executing a head-on pass or a diving pursuit closed the distance to the bomber at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. A closure rate of that magnitude meant that a fighter crossing the 300-yard mark would be in point-blank firing position within a fraction of a second. More importantly, the Luftwaffe had equipped their interceptors with 20mm cannons firing highly explosive shells that could tear the wing off a B-17 from a distance of 600 yards. The American doctrine essentially required the gunners to sit motionless and watch as the German fighters entered their optimal firing range, unleashed a devastating volley of explosive cannon fire, and then banked away before the Americans were even allowed to pull the triggers of their defensive machine guns. Among the thousands of young men shoved into this meat grinder was a 23-year-old staff sergeant named Michael Aruth, a tail gunner assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group stationed at Royal Air Force Kimbolton. Aruth occupied the most dangerous and psychologically isolating position in the entire bomber, the tail gunner compartment. Dubbed the suicide seat by the crews, the tail compartment was a cramped, freezing, claustrophobic glass and aluminum box protruding from the rear of the aircraft. To reach his station, Aruth had to crawl on his hands and knees over the narrow catwalk spanning the open bomb bay and crawl through the length of the unpressurized fuselage. Once inside the tail, he was entirely cut off from the rest of the crew, communicating only through a crackling throat microphone. He knelt on a small padded bicycle seat, his knees pressed against the cold metal, staring out through a small pane of plexiglass directly into the slipstream. His weapons were two Browning M250 caliber heavy machine guns protruding from a canvas boot. These guns were absolute masterpieces of lethal engineering, capable of firing an 800-grain armor-piercing incendiary projectile at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy of the 50 caliber bullet was catastrophic, capable of shattering engine blocks and turning aluminum aircraft frames to shrapnel. Aruth possessed a deep intuitive understanding of his weapons and a profound distrust of the officers who wrote the training manuals. He recognized immediately that waiting for a German fighter to close within 300 yards was a death sentence. Aruth completely abandoned the official doctrine and developed his own radical method of survival. He recognized that the Browning 50 caliber possessed an absolute maximum ballistic range far exceeding the official estimates. He decided to implement aggressive long-range suppressive fire. When Aruth spotted a Luftwaffe formation forming up for an attack, he did not wait. He began firing short controlled bursts at ranges of 700 and even 800 yards. The officers who observed this behavior were furious. They accused him of panicking under pressure and wasting precious ammunition on impossible shots. They warned him that his reckless behavior would leave his guns empty when the fighters actually closed in for the kill. They mocked his civilian lack of discipline and threatened him with court-martial if he continued to violate the published regulations of the Army Air Forces. But Aruth understood a psychological and tactical truth that the manuals entirely missed. Aerial combat was a contest of nerves as much as it was a contest of ballistics. The German fighter pilots were veterans of the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain. They were trained to execute precise mathematical attack runs, calculating their lead and deflection based on the steady flight path of the bomber. When Aruth opened fire at 800 yards, he completely disrupted their attack geometry. The German pilots suddenly found themselves flying into a dense wall of bright red tracer ammunition long before they were prepared to engage. The visual shock of heavy machine gun fire snapping past their canopies forced the Luftwaffe pilots to react prematurely. They would instinctively flinch, jink, or break off their attack runs, entirely altering their trajectory and ruining their carefully calculated firing solutions. Even if Aruth did not score a direct hit at that extreme range, the suppressive fire forced the enemy to expend their kinetic energy in evasive maneuvers, rendering them far less lethal by the time they closed the distance. Aruth was using the incredible range and psychological impact of the heavy machine gun to project a defensive shield far beyond the physical structure of his bomber, a tactic that his superiors dismissed as suicidal incompetence. The true test of Aruth and his forbidden method arrived on the morning of July 30, 1943. The objective for the 379th Bombardment Group was the Fieseler Aircraft Assembly Plant and the aero engine shops located deep within the industrial center of Kassel, Germany. The target was critical to the German war effort and was therefore defended by one of the most concentrated anti-aircraft networks and fighter umbrellas in the Third Reich. The mission required the bomber stream to penetrate hundreds of miles into hostile airspace completely unescorted. The American P-47 Thunderbolt fighters lacked the fuel capacity to accompany the heavy bombers beyond the borders of occupied Europe, leaving the B-17s completely naked and exposed as they crossed into Germany. Aruth climbed into the tail of his assigned aircraft, a B-17 named Tondaleo, and strapped on his heavy sheepskin flying suit, his electrically heated boots, and his oxygen mask. The four massive Wright Cyclone radial engines roared to life, vibrating the aluminum frame as the bomber taxied down the runway and lifted heavily into the gray English sky, joining a massive formation of 186 heavy bombers clawing their way toward the stratosphere. As the bomber stream reached its cruising altitude of 25,000 feet, the physical reality of the environment became as lethal as the enemy. The temperature inside the unheated fuselage plummeted to -40°F. The air was so thin that a man would lose consciousness within 3 minutes without supplemental oxygen. The crews operated in a state of constant physical misery, surrounded by the smell of ozone, high-test aviation fuel, and hydraulic fluid. Aruth knelt in his isolated glass box, constantly scanning the vast empty expanse of the sky behind the formation. The sheer physical exertion required to manually swing the heavy twin 50 caliber machine guns against the resistance of the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream was exhausting. Every movement was restricted by layers of bulky flight clothing and the cumbersome oxygen hoses connecting him to the life support system of the aircraft. He watched the contrails of the formation stretching out like massive white highways across the sky, pointing an unmistakable arrow directly toward their target for the German radar operators below. The Luftwaffe response was overwhelming. The German ground controllers scrambled over 300 interceptors from airfields scattered across Germany and occupied Europe, directing them into a massive blocking force ahead of the approaching American bombers. As the bomber stream crossed the German frontier, the sky ahead of Tondaleo suddenly filled with tiny black dots, rapidly expanding into the distinct, terrifying silhouettes of Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 fighters. The German pilots utilized a tactic known as the company front attack, lining up abreast and diving straight through the American formation with all guns blazing, trying to break the structural cohesion of the combat box. The air instantly filled with the chaotic geometry of aerial warfare. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in chaotic webs, and the deafening roar of the bomber engines was punctuated by the sharp mechanical hammering of hundreds of machine guns returning fire. Bombers began to fall from the formation, trailing thick plumes of black smoke, and fire their crews, bailing out into the freezing void as the Luftwaffe systematically dismantled the leading elements of the strike force. Aruth watched as a swarm of yellow-nosed Messerschmitts banked sharply around the perimeter of the formation, sliding into position to attack the bombers from the rear. He recognized the tactical setup immediately. The fighters were staging out of range, preparing to execute a high-speed tail attack to target the vulnerable control surfaces and the unprotected rear of the bomber. Aruth did not wait for the enemy to cross the mandatory 300-yard line. He gripped the spade grips of his twin Brownings, estimated the range at 800 yards, applied his calculated deflection, and squeezed the triggers. The heavy guns shuddered violently, hurling a continuous stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds across the sky. The officers in the formation who witnessed this action were appalled, watching the tail gunner of Tondileo ostensibly wasting his ammunition on targets that were little more than specks in the distance. But the mathematics of the 50 caliber bullet proved the experts entirely wrong. Aruth tracked a lead Messerschmitt making its diving run. He watched his tracers arc gracefully through the thin air, intersecting perfectly with the flight path of the incoming fighter. The sheer volume and precision of the fire caught the German pilot completely by surprise. Before the Messerschmitt could even bring its own 20mm cannons into effective range, the 50 caliber projectiles ripped through the thin aluminum skin of its engine cowling. The incendiary compound inside the bullets ignited upon impact, shattering the liquid cooling lines and severing the fuel manifold. The fighter instantly erupted into a brilliant ball of orange flame, violently pitching downward and spinning wildly out of control toward the earth far below. Aruth had just scored a confirmed kill at a range that official doctrine declared absolutely impossible. He had destroyed the enemy without allowing them to fire a single shot in return, validating his radical theory of long-range suppressive fire in the most absolute and lethal manner possible. The destruction of the lead fighter temporarily scattered the attacking element, but the Luftwaffe possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. For the next 2 hours, the bomber stream fought a running battle of attrition across the skies of Germany. Aruth remained locked in a state of absolute hyper-focused concentration, swinging his guns from target to target, firing short controlled bursts to prevent the barrels from melting under the extreme friction. The noise inside his compartment was a continuous concussive roar. Empty brass casings and steel links piled up around his knees as he fed hundreds of rounds through the breeches of the weapons. The Tondileo was taking heavy damage. The skin of the bomber was perforated by thousands of shrapnel fragments and machine gun bullets. The plexiglass of the waist windows had been shattered, and the freezing slipstream was tearing through the interior of the fuselage, freezing the blood of the wounded crewmen. Yet the formation held together, pushing relentlessly toward the industrial target. As the bombers approached the city of Kassel, the anti-aircraft batteries defending the city opened fire. The sky turned black with the dense, terrifying explosions of 88mm flak. The concussive shockwaves of the exploding shells violently tossed the 30-ton bombers around like toys in a hurricane. Tondileo shuddered heavily as shrapnel tore through the right wing, taking out one of the superchargers and causing the engine to trail thick white smoke. The bombardier hunched over the Norden bombsight, guided the crippled aircraft through the final seconds of the bomb run, releasing the payload over the sprawling factory complex below. The moment the bombs away signal flashed, the formation immediately banked hard to the west, beginning the agonizingly long flight back toward the safety of the English Channel. But the German fighter controllers, recognizing that the bombers were now damaged, scattered, and low on ammunition, directed a massive secondary wave of fresh interceptors to annihilate the surviving American aircraft on their journey home. The attacks on the withdrawal route were utterly fanatical. The Luftwaffe pilots, utilizing their superior speed and maneuverability, systematically picked off the stragglers that had fallen behind the main defensive box. Tondileo, struggling with engine damage, was losing altitude and slowly drifting away from the protective crossfire of the formation. The bomber became a prime target for a pair of Focke-Wulf 190 interceptors that dropped out of the sun, matching the speed of the American aircraft and positioning themselves directly in the blind spot behind the tail. Aruth, tracking the incoming threat through his shattered plexiglass window, swung his guns to bear and engaged the lead fighter. He poured a concentrated stream of fire directly into the radial engine of the Focke-Wulf, watching pieces of the cowling tear away as the massive bullets found their mark. The fighter pulled up sharply, trailing dark oil and abandoning the attack. Aruth had secured his second aerial victory of the mission, relying entirely on the mechanical reliability of his weapons and his own precise optical calculations. But the wingman of the destroyed Focke-Wulf was not deterred. The second German pilot, witnessing the destruction of his comrade, executed a brilliant and highly aggressive maneuver. He pushed the throttle completely forward, diving below the trajectory of Aruth's guns and then pulling up violently, bringing his 4 20mm cannons directly into alignment with the tail compartment of Tondileo. The German pilot fired a devastating concentrated burst at point-blank range. The explosive Meningeschoss shells specifically designed to detonate after penetrating the aluminum skin of the bomber tore through the thin structure of the tail gunner's compartment. The physical destruction was catastrophic. The explosion instantly shattered the protective armor plating behind Ruth, filling the tiny compartment with jagged red-hot steel shrapnel and the blinding flash of high explosives. The sheer concussive force of the blast threw Ruth violently against the control yokes of his machine guns. A massive piece of jagged shrapnel tore through the thick layers of his sheepskin flight trousers, entirely shattering his left leg above the knee. The pain was immediate and absolute, a sickening wave of agony that nearly caused him to lose consciousness on the spot. Warm blood instantly began to pump from the severed arteries, soaking his uniform and immediately beginning to freeze in the -40-degree air whipping through the massive holes in the fuselage. But the physical trauma of the shattered leg was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The shrapnel from the exploding cannon shell had completely severed the main oxygen supply line connecting Ruth's mask to the aircraft's central life support system. The hiss of escaping oxygen was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Within seconds, Ruth was breathing dead, freezing air completely devoid of the oxygen his brain desperately required to function at 25,000 feet. The physiological effects of severe anoxia are insidious and terrifying. The human brain deprived of oxygen begins to shut down non-essential functions within moments. Vision begins to tunnel, narrowing down to a tiny point of light. Motor control becomes sluggish and uncoordinated, followed by a euphoric sense of detachment and finally absolute unconsciousness, leading rapidly to death. Ruth, gasping for breath in the freezing void, recognized the symptoms immediately. He reached down with his heavy gloves, desperately trying to crimp the severed rubber hose to stop the leak, but the line was completely shredded. He knew that an emergency walk-around oxygen bottle was clipped to the bulkhead a few feet away. But reaching that bottle required him to unclip his safety harness, leave his firing position, and drag his shattered, bleeding body across the floor of the compartment. The entire process would take precious seconds during which the rear of the bomber would be completely defenseless against the swarming German fighters. The situation inside the rest of the Tondileo was equally chaotic. The pilot fighting the controls of the severely damaged bomber began executing violent evasive maneuvers, throwing the heavy aircraft into extreme corkscrews and steep dives to throw off the aim of the pursuing fighters. The internal intercom system had been entirely knocked out by the cannon blast, plunging the crew into a terrifying silence. The men in the waste compartment, seeing the massive structural damage to the tail and watching the bomber plunge toward the earth, completely lost their nerve. Believing that the aircraft was in an unrecoverable death dive and that the pilot was already dead, several members of the crew panicked. They ripped off their headsets, clipped on their parachutes, forced open the waste hatches, and bailed out into the freezing sky, abandoning the crippled fortress. Ruth, completely isolated in the rear of the aircraft, felt the sudden shifts in the center of gravity and realized that he was largely alone in a dying machine. Faced with the choice of saving his own life by reaching for the emergency oxygen bottle or staying at his guns to defend the aircraft, Ruth made a decision that defined the absolute limits of human endurance and military duty. He abandoned the attempt to secure his oxygen mask. He ignored the catastrophic trauma of his shattered leg and the massive blood loss. He pulled himself back upright on the small bicycle seat, pressing his face against the shattered plexiglass, and gripped the handles of his twin Browning machine guns. He was rapidly fading into unconsciousness, his vision reduced to a blur, his lungs burning for air, but he refused to abandon his post. As the German fighters circled back for the final killing blow, Ruth attempted to rack the charging handles of his weapons. He discovered that the left machine gun had been completely destroyed by the cannon blast, the receiver shattered and the barrel permanently jammed. He was left with a single operational .50 caliber machine gun, a shattered leg, and no oxygen. The German fighters, seeing the severe damage to the tail of the bomber and assuming the gunner was dead, moved in for a relaxed textbook execution. A Messerschmitt 109 lined up directly on the tail, throttling back to perfectly match the speed of the crippled B-17. The pilot was so close that Ruth could clearly see the details of the mechanic's flight helmet and the spinning hub of the propeller. Operating entirely on pure adrenaline and muscle memory, Ruth swung his single heavy machine gun onto the target. The effort required to move the weapon with only one functioning leg to brace himself was excruciating. He waited until the Messerschmitt filled the entire reticle of his optical sight and squeezed the trigger. The single Browning roared to life, punching a solid line of armor-piercing incendiary rounds directly through the reinforced armored glass of the German cockpit. The enemy pilot was killed instantly. The Messerschmitt violently pitched upward, stalled, and then fell away into a vertical spin, disappearing into the clouds below. Aruth had secured his third kill of the mission while bleeding to death and suffocating. But the mechanical nightmare was not over. The extreme cold, the continuous firing, and the sheer volume of dirt and cordite inside the shattered compartment finally took their toll on his last surviving weapon. As Aruth attempted to track a fourth incoming fighter, a Focke-Wulf rolling in from a high deflection angle, the heavy bolt of the Browning slammed forward and stopped dead. A ruptured brass casing had completely jammed in the breech, locking the weapon solid. A jammed machine gun in aerial combat is a death sentence. Standard procedure required the gunner to use a specialized extraction tool to pry the hot brass from the chamber, a process that was difficult even under perfect conditions. Aruth did not have the tool. He did not have the time. And his brain was rapidly failing from the absolute lack of oxygen. The Focke-Wulf was closing the distance, its wings sparkling as it opened fire with its heavy cannons, the explosive shells walking their way up the fuselage of the Tondileo. In an act of sheer desperate willpower, Aruth ripped off his heavy electrically heated gloves, exposing his bare hands to the -40-degree slipstream. He reached directly into the freezing steel of the receiver assembly. The metal instantly burned his skin, tearing the flesh from his fingers as he desperately clawed at the jammed casing. The physical pain was entirely overshadowed by the overwhelming terror of the incoming fighter. Utilizing raw mechanical leverage and absolute desperation, he managed to pry the crushed brass out of the chamber. He racked the heavy steel charging handle, chambering a fresh round into the breech. He grabbed the spade grips with his bloody, freezing hands, reacquired the diving Focke-Wulf, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon fired perfectly. A massive concentrated burst of heavy caliber fire struck the German fighter directly in the wing root, perfectly severing the main structural spar. The entire left wing of the Focke-Wulf tore away from the fuselage, instantly destroying the aerodynamics of the aircraft. The fighter tumbled violently out of the sky, trailing a massive ribbon of aviation fuel and smoke. 4 confirmed kills in a single mission, a feat of aerial gunnery that bordered on the miraculous. The destruction of the fourth fighter finally broke the morale of the pursuing Luftwaffe squadron. The surviving German pilots, low on ammunition and fuel, banked heavily away, diving toward their bases and leaving the crippled Tondileo alone in the hostile sky. Aruth, having eliminated the immediate tactical threat, finally succumbed to the overwhelming physiological trauma. The lack of oxygen, the massive hemorrhage, and the sheer adrenaline exhaustion completely overloaded his central nervous system. He collapsed over the spade grips of his smoking machine gun, his blood freezing to the aluminum deck plates of the tail compartment, entirely unconscious as the pilot wrestled the heavily damaged bomber across the coast of occupied Europe and out over the gray waters of the English Channel. The aircraft was barely flying, losing altitude steadily as the engines choked on their own failing lifeblood, but the structural integrity held just long enough. Hours later, the Tondileo, dragging its shattered tail and trailing smoke from 2 dead engines, limped into the landing pattern at Royal Air Force Kimbolton. The bomber did not land, it crashed onto the runway, the main landing gear collapsing under the structural damage, sending the massive aluminum frame screaming across the concrete in a shower of sparks before finally coming to a violent halt. The base emergency crews, ambulances, and crash trucks rushed to the smoking wreckage, anticipating a total loss of life. When the medical personnel forced open the crushed access door of the tail compartment, they were greeted by an unimaginable scene of carnage. The compartment was completely destroyed, the walls painted with frozen blood, the floor littered with hundreds of empty brass casings, and the shattered remnants of the destroyed left machine gun. Tangled within the wreckage, completely unconscious and barely clinging to life, was Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, his hands torn open by the frozen steel, his leg catastrophically wounded, his face blackened by cordite and freezing temperatures. The mechanics and intelligence officers who inspected the Tondileo after the medical crews extracted the wounded could scarcely believe the physical evidence. The tail compartment had sustained a direct point-blank hit from a 20mm explosive cannon shell. By all laws of physics and human physiology, the gunner should have been instantly vaporized or bled to death within minutes. The fact that he not only survived the initial blast but managed to manually repair a jammed heavy machine gun with bare hands at 25,000 feet without supplemental oxygen and successfully shoot down 2 additional enemy fighters was entirely beyond the comprehension of the military analysts. When they reviewed the gun camera footage from the accompanying bombers and the debriefing reports of the surviving crew, they confirmed the absolute reality of Aruth's actions. He had single-handedly broken the back of the Luftwaffe attack, utilizing his forbidden long-range suppressive fire tactics and his sheer refusal to abandon his post. The recovery of Michael Aruth was a long and agonizing process. The flight surgeons managed to save his shattered leg, performing multiple complex surgeries to extract the jagged steel shrapnel and rebuild the severed bone and muscle tissue. During his convalescence, the story of his unbelievable stand over Kassel spread rapidly throughout the bomber bases of the 8th Air Force. The High Command, the very officers who had previously mocked his civilian lack of discipline and threatened him with court-martial for wasting ammunition, were forced to confront the undeniable mathematical success of his tactical rebellion. Aruth was formally recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government for his actions on July 30, 1943. The award was eventually downgraded through the complex bureaucratic channels of the military establishment, but he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for extreme valor in combat, presented for his extraordinary heroism, complete disregard for his personal safety, and his absolute refusal to abandon his crew. But the true legacy of Michael Aruth's actions extended far beyond the ribbon pinned to his uniform. His survival and his incredible success completely shattered the institutionalized dogma of the Army Air Force's gunnery schools. The training manuals were quietly but definitively rewritten. Instructors stopped demanding that gunners hold their fire until 300 yards. Instead, the new doctrine recognized the immense psychological and tactical value of long-range suppressive fire, heavily influenced by the undeniable empirical evidence provided by the tail gunner of the Tondileo. The concept of utilizing the maximum ballistic capability of the Browning 50 caliber machine gun to disrupt the attack geometry of the Luftwaffe fighters became standard operating procedure, saving the lives of countless bomber crews in the subsequent bloody years of the strategic bombing campaign. Aruth had proven that the rigid theoretical models of warfare drafted in safe offices were entirely useless against the chaotic and compromising reality of aerial combat. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth refused to let his combat career end in a hospital bed. Despite his severe injuries, he successfully petitioned to be returned to active flight status. He climbed back into the freezing, claustrophobic suicide seat of the B-17 tail compartment and continued to fly deep penetration missions over the most heavily defended targets in the Third Reich. He continued to employ his aggressive precision gunnery, completely dominating the airspace behind his aircraft. By the end of his combat tour, Aruth had racked up a staggering total of 17 confirmed fighter kills accumulated over just 14 combat missions. He was officially recognized as the highest-scoring bomber gunner in the entire history of the United States Army Air Forces, a record that remains completely unbroken. He had transformed the most vulnerable defensive position in the heavy bomber into an absolute lethal instrument of aerial execution, destroying the equivalent of an entire Luftwaffe fighter squadron entirely on his own. The story of the rebel gunner and the Tondileo represents the ultimate triumph of practical empirical lethality over theoretical military bureaucracy. The war was not won simply by the mass production of heavy bombers or the implementation of grand strategic concepts. It was won by individuals like Michael Aruth, young men thrust into an environment of absolute industrial horror who possessed the critical intelligence to recognize when the rules were wrong and the unparalleled courage to rewrite those rules in the heat of combat. The absolute physical reality of the freezing air, the smell of the cordite, the violent concussion of the explosive shells, and the mechanical perfection of the heavy machine gun, these are the unyielding facts that define the history of the bomber war. Aruth's secret weapon was not a classified piece of technology or a hidden mechanical modification. It was his deep understanding of ballistics, his unshakable trust in his own calculations, and his absolute refusal to die according to the regulations printed in a manual. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of Aruth's accomplishment, one must constantly return to the physical parameters of the B-17 tail compartment. It was an environment actively hostile to human survival. The gunner was isolated from the camaraderie and the shared terror of the rest of the crew. He sat facing backwards, watching the destruction of the world unfold behind the aircraft, completely unable to see where he was going, only where he had been. When the German fighters attacked, they almost always focused on the tail, utilizing the blind spots and attempting to knock out the rear gunner first to open up the entire formation to slaughter. The men who manned these positions were a unique breed, requiring a level of psychological resilience that is difficult to articulate. They watched their friends and other bombers explode into fireballs. They tracked the incoming tracers heading directly for their own faces, and they knew that their primary defense was their own steady hands on the spade grips of their weapons. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun, the instrument of Aruth's massive success, is a weapon that demands profound respect. Designed by John Browning after the First World War, it is an air-cooled belt-fed heavy machine gun that operates on a short recoil principle. The massive weight of the reciprocating bolt and the heavy barrel completely absorb the extreme pressures generated by the immense .50 caliber cartridge. When Aruth fired those weapons, he was controlling an incredible amount of kinetic energy. The sound of the twin guns firing simultaneously inside the small aluminum box was deafening, a concussive hammering that vibrated through the bones of the gunner. The weapon required meticulous maintenance, careful headspace and timing adjustments, and absolute cleanliness to function reliably in the freezing temperatures of high-altitude flight. The fact that Aruth was able to clear a complex mechanical malfunction, clear a ruptured brass casing from a searing hot chamber with his bare freezing hands while suffering from severe hypoxia, is a testament to his intimate, profound mastery of the machinery that kept him alive. The German aircraft he faced, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, were marvels of aeronautical engineering. The Focke-Wulf in particular was heavily armored, heavily armed, and incredibly rugged. Its BMW 801 radial engine provided massive power and a wide protective shield for the pilot. To shoot down one of these aircraft required extreme precision, striking the vulnerable oil coolers, the fuel lines, or the canopy glass. Aruth achieved this precision consistently while firing from a moving platform that was violently vibrating and maneuvering while the target itself was closing at hundreds of miles per hour. This is an exercise in complex multivariable calculus executed purely through instinct, practice, and visual estimation. The optical ring and bead sight of the B-17 tail gun was a primitive instrument requiring the gunner to mentally calculate the lead, the bullet drop, and the relative speed of the target. Aruth's ability to perform these calculations instantly under the most extreme duress imaginable elevates him to the absolute pinnacle of combat marksman. The documentation of these events, the mission logs, the gun camera footage, the medical reports, and the debriefings of the surviving crew absolutely confirm the factual reality of the July 30 mission. There is no requirement to dramatize the narrative because the unvarnished truth is inherently cinematic and utterly terrifying. It is a story of a single man bleeding and suffocating, trapped in a shattered glass box 5 miles above the earth, holding off an entire squadron of elite enemy fighters with a single machine gun. The historical record must preserve these exact mechanical and physiological details to ensure that the true nature of the air war is never romanticized or misunderstood. The heavy bombers did not simply fly over Germany and drop their payloads, they fought agonizing, bloody battles of attrition where the survival of the aircraft depended entirely on the brutal, localized violence inflicted by the gunners. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, the man who defied the experts and destroyed 17 enemy fighters, stands as the ultimate embodiment of that violent reality, a quiet, unassuming master of the heavy machine gun who wrote his own manual in the blood and fire of the skies over Europe.